Democrats released 3 emails Wednesday calling into question how much President Trump knew about Jeffrey Epstein's sex crimes. In one from 2011, Epstein tells his accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell, "I want you to realize that dog that hasn't barked is Trump. Victim spent hours at my house with him." And in another from 2019, Epstein tells columnist Michael Wolff, of course he knew about the girls as he asked Ghislaine to stop.
It is not a coincidence that the Democrats leaked these emails to the fake news this morning ahead of Republicans reopening the government.
Calling it a smear campaign, the White House denies the president was involved in any wrongdoing, while Democrats continue to push for the release of all of the Epstein files.
He campaigned on releasing all the Epstein files, obsessed about it. His vice president obsessed about it. And now the White House is involved in a massive cover-up, and we want to know why won't they release the files?
Hello and welcome, guys. Adam is here. So what just happened, guys? House Oversight Democrats have released approximately 23,000 pages from Epstein's estate, verified by multiple Tier 1 news organizations. A bombshell documented by PBS, CNN, the BBC, The Guardian, and the New York Times, converging on the same facts from independent directions. Among those pages is a 2011 email from Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell that is stunning in its implications, and this is the most comprehensively documented Epstein briefing to date. He wrote that he spent hours at my house with Trump and noted that Trump has never once been mentioned. Let that sink in for a moment. This is 2011, years after Epstein's 2008 guilty plea, years after Trump publicly claimed he had banned Epstein from Mar-a-Lago and said they had a falling out. And yet here is Epstein himself, in a private communication with Maxwell, describing Trump as having spent hours at his house.
We have breaking news. The White House is responding after Democrats on the House Oversight Committee released some of sex offender Jeffrey Epstein's emails referencing President Trump. In a 2011 email, Epstein referred to Donald Trump as the, quote, dog that hasn't barked, and told his former companion, Ghislaine Maxwell, that an alleged victim had spent hours at his house with Trump. The head Democrat on the committee says the emails raise questions about a White House cover-up of the Epstein files. But Republicans in the White House say Democrats are trying to create a fake narrative to slander the president. Trump has denied any wrongdoing and any knowledge of Epstein's crimes. ABC's Jay O'Brien has the latest. Jay, how do these emails fit into the Epstein investigation, and how's the White House responding?
So they were released this morning, Diane, as you say, by Democrats on the House Oversight Committee. They are part of thousands of pages of records from the Epstein estate that this committee has obtained. The Republicans on the committee just dropped tens of thousands of pages of records from the Epstein estate, somewhat in response to this. But that one email that you just referenced is so far from what we have seen the most notable.
Not a quick meeting, not a casual drop-by, hours. And then he adds the really interesting part. He notes that Trump has never once been mentioned, as in never been scrutinized, never been investigated, never been held accountable for whatever Epstein thought he deserved accountability for. And Maxwell's reply? She wrote back, "I have been thinking about that." Just 4 words, but they speak volumes. She had been thinking about it too. She had been reflecting on the same question Epstein was raising. What does it mean that Trump has escaped the kind of public scrutiny that Epstein and Maxwell themselves were facing? What does it mean that Trump's name never came up in the same way? Maxwell, remember, was later convicted on multiple counts, including sex trafficking of a minor. Her documented reply to Epstein's observation that Trump has never once been mentioned is evidence that the two of them were actively discussing Trump's conspicuous absence from public scrutiny. What they were thinking and what that implies is left undefined by the documented reply itself, but the fact that they were discussing it at all is significant.
Earlier in the day, House Democrats releasing emails obtained from the Epstein estate. Those emails include a 2011 exchange between Epstein and his co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell. Epstein writing the, quote, dog that hasn't barked is Trump, adding one of his victims spent hours with Trump at Epstein's home, but that Trump has never once been mentioned. Maxwell replying, "I have been thinking about that." House Republicans and the White House identifying the victim as Virginia Giuffre, who once worked at Trump's spa at Mar-a-Lago. Giuffre said she never saw Trump do anything inappropriate. She died by suicide earlier this year. Trump and Epstein were friends for more than a decade. After Epstein's arrest in 2019, Trump said he hadn't spoken to him in 15 years. He insists he broke off the friendship when he learned Epstein and Maxwell were luring away female staffers who worked at Mar-a-Lago. In a 2019 email to author Michael Wolff, Epstein writing, Trump said he asked me to resign, never a member ever. Of course, he knew about the girls as he asked Ghislaine to stop.
But that's not all. CNN documented a separate email where Epstein wrote to a contact that he knows how dirty Donald is and called Trump borderline insane. Now, this is where things get really interesting because it shows that Epstein's private characterizations of Trump were not exclusively positive. He wasn't just a Trump booster writing glowing things about his friend. He was also expressing serious negative views, calling him dirty, calling him borderline insane. That complexity is important, and we'll come back to it because the Republican counter-release of documents confirms this two-sided picture from the other direction. Now, the BBC documented something else that adds another layer to this story. Under a disclosure law that Trump himself signed, the DOJ released approximately 3.5 million pages of Epstein-related material. That's a staggering volume of documents. And in January of this year, they released an additional 3 million pages, bringing the total to a mind-boggling collection of material.
Let's go straight to the U.S., where House Democrats say they have received new emails from the estate of the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein that reference President Trump. This is the social media account for the Democrats on the House Oversight Committee. They say the emails from Epstein raise serious concerns about how much Donald Trump knew about his behavior. And in the last few minutes, we've had a statement from the White House in response. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt says the Democrats selectively leaked emails to the liberal media to create a fake narrative to smear President Trump. Mr. Trump has consistently denied any wrongdoing in relation to Epstein.
NPR and the Miami Herald documented that Trump's name appears over 1,000 times in these release files. That's more than twice as often as any other individual. Let me repeat that because it's absolutely crucial. Trump's name appears more than 1,000 times in Epstein's private communications, more than twice as often as anyone else. Now, let me explain why that finding is so significant, even though it does not establish criminal conduct. Throughout this Epstein accountability series, we have been documenting the gap between what was publicly known and what was actually in the files. The 50 missing pages documented by NPR, the prominent name slide deck with Trump at the top, documented by the New York Times, and the statutory non-compliance by the DOJ that we covered in previous briefs. The 1,000-plus mentions finding is the aggregate quantitative documentation of that gap in its clearest available form. A person who appears more than twice as often as any other individual in a convicted sex offender's private communications, in a collection of 3.5 million pages covering Epstein's entire documented operational network, is not merely a peripheral acquaintance. The frequency of Trump's appearance in the files is the documented measure of Epstein's sustained documented engagement with Trump as a subject. That is distinct from but connected to the question of what their actual relationship involved. It tells us that Trump was on Epstein's mind, that he was a frequent subject of discussion in Epstein's private communications, and that this engagement continued for years after the publicly acknowledged end of their relationship. Now here's where we have to be really careful. The Guardian conducted a close examination of the files and underscored that the documents do not implicate Trump in misconduct. The DOJ's Todd Blanche told Fox News, and this was documented by The Guardian, that after reviewing years of Epstein communications, they found no communications in which Epstein said Trump committed crimes against victims. And the DOJ concluded there was no evidence to charge Trump. That is the most authoritative official finding available, and it deserves prominent placement in any honest assessment of these documents. But here's the rub. The no evidence to charge conclusion is specifically about chargeable criminal conduct. It does not address the documented gap between the distant acquaintance public characterization that Trump has offered and the 1,000-plus mentions more than twice as often as anyone else documented relationship extent. You can have a situation where someone is not guilty of a crime but has a relationship that is much closer and more sustained than they have publicly acknowledged. That's the space where these documents operate. The Guardian also documented that Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick arranged a family trip to Epstein's Caribbean island through emails showing coordination. Now, this is particularly striking because Lutnick told the New York Times that he had never met Epstein. That's a direct contradiction between documented evidence and public statement. A sitting cabinet secretary whose documented email record shows family trip coordination to Epstein's island publicly claiming to have never met Epstein is a documented public statement contradiction whose accountability significance is independent of Epstein's unverified characterizations of Trump. This is not Epstein making a claim. This is documentary evidence against a public statement by a government official. And then there's the Bannon correspondence. The Guardian documented extensive Epstein-Bannon email correspondence, including a long video interview and exchanges where they joked about Trump and discussed PR strategies to rehabilitate Epstein's image. This is documented evidence of a sustained working relationship between Epstein and Trump's former chief strategist, extending into the period after Epstein's 2008 conviction and into the Trump political era. Epstein discussing PR strategies with Bannon to rehabilitate his own image, in the context of Epstein being a convicted sex offender attempting to manage public perception, and Bannon being a central figure in Trump's political operation, is the specific inner circle connection whose documentary evidence the file's release most directly establishes. The exchanges joking about Trump add the personal relationship with the president dimension to what was already a documented Epstein-Bannon professional correspondence around image rehabilitation. This is not just some distant connection. This is the chief strategist for Trump's political operation working with Epstein on image management while also joking about Trump himself. And finally, NPR documented that Republicans on the Oversight Committee responded to the Democrats' document release by posting approximately 2,000 additional pages, showing that Epstein also frequently criticized Trump and worried about his mental state, not just positive references. The Republican counter-release is the institutional competing release dimension of the Epstein file accountability story. Republican Oversight Committee members posting documents showing Epstein's criticisms of Trump and concerns about Trump's mental state is the documented institutional attempt to present a counter-narrative. Epstein was not simply a Trump booster, but also a private Trump critic. Now, that counter-narrative is actually consistent with the broader documented picture. The knows how dirty Donald and borderline insane characterizations from the Oversight Democrats' release and the private criticism from the Republican counter-release together document a complex Epstein-Trump dynamic. Epstein simultaneously claimed extensive personal contact, made private negative characterizations of Trump, puzzled over why Trump had escaped public scrutiny, and is documented as having continued to discuss Trump extensively in his private communications throughout his later life. It's a mess of contradictions, but it's all documented, and that documentation is what matters. So let me be really clear about what all of this means. Let's break down what the documented email releases, the DOJ no evidence conclusion, the Lutnick contradiction, and the Bannon correspondence collectively add to the Epstein accountability record. Because if you're just looking at headlines, you're going to miss the nuance, and the nuance is where the real story lives. The first thing to understand is the specific distinction that The Guardian articulates and which needs to be at the center of any responsible coverage of this brief. The documents do not implicate Trump in misconduct, but they do reveal how close the friendship once was. That Guardian formulation captures the specific dual accountability picture that the Epstein files create. They are not evidence of criminal conduct, and the DOJ reviewed years of communications and found no chargeable evidence. But they are also not consistent with the distant acquaintance characterization that Trump has publicly offered. The 1,000+ Trump mentions more than twice as often as anyone else finding. The 2011 "spent hours at my house" email written 3 years after the publicly characterized falling out. The sustained inner circle connections through Lutnick and Bannon. All of this is documented evidence of a relationship that was more extensive and more sustained than the public characterization acknowledged. The gap between the documented relationship extent and the publicly characterized relationship extent is the specific accountability finding, not criminal conduct, but extensive sustained connection that contradicts distant acquaintances. Think about what it means for someone to appear more than 1,000 times in someone else's private communications. This isn't a casual acquaintance. This isn't someone you bump into at parties once in a while. This is someone who is a constant subject of discussion, someone who is on your mind, someone who you're communicating about with your closest associates. And when that someone is a convicted sex offender and you are a public figure who has repeatedly downplayed the relationship, the gap between the documented reality and the public narrative becomes a story in itself. The second layer we're dealing with is the Lutnick contradiction and what it adds as an inner circle accountability finding distinct from Epstein's characterizations of Trump. We have been careful throughout this series to note that Epstein's claims about other people are unverified claims from a convicted sex offender rather than independently corroborated facts. The Lutnick documented coordination emails versus never met Epstein public statement contradiction does not rely on Epstein's credibility. It relies on the documentary evidence of the emails themselves and on Lutnick's documented public statement to the New York Times. A sitting cabinet secretary whose documented email record shows family trip coordination to Epstein's island, publicly claiming to have never met Epstein, is a documented public statement contradiction whose accountability significance is independent of Epstein's unverified characterizations of Trump. This is not he said, she said. This is documentary evidence against a public statement. This is something that can be verified independently. It doesn't matter whether you believe Epstein or not. The emails exist. The public statement exists. The contradiction is there for anyone to see. And think about what this means for the broader picture of who was connected to Epstein and how deeply those connections ran. Lutnick is not some peripheral figure. He's the Commerce Secretary, a senior member of Trump's cabinet. If he was arranging family trips to Epstein's island, if his email record shows coordination around those trips, and if he then publicly claimed to have never met Epstein, that raises serious questions about what else might be hidden in these files and who else might have connections they're not being honest about. The third layer is the Bannon-Epstein correspondence and what it documents about the relationship between Epstein's convicted sex offender image rehabilitation project and Trump's political operations chief strategist. Bannon participated in a long video interview with Epstein and discussed PR strategies to rehabilitate Epstein's image while simultaneously serving as the chief strategist for Trump's political operation. There is a documented connection between Epstein's documented effort to manage his post-conviction public image and the Trump political world's most senior strategic figure. That connection, documented by The Guardian through the release files, is the specific inner circle accountability finding whose significance extends beyond the Epstein-Trump social relationship into the documented professional collaboration between Epstein's image operation and the Trump political operation. This isn't just about personal friendship. This is about professional coordination. This is about Epstein working with a senior Trump strategist to manage public perception. This is about the Trump political machine being entangled with Epstein's rehabilitation efforts. Now, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the arguments that Trump and his supporters would make about what the Epstein files do and don't show. Because if we're going to be fair, if we're going to be honest, we have to present the full picture, including the counter-arguments. And let me tell you, they have some strong points. They would argue that the no evidence to charge DOJ conclusion stated by Blanche to Fox News and confirmed by The Guardian's independent analysis is the most authoritative accountability finding, and that it definitively establishes Trump's innocence of any criminal connection to Epstein's activities. They would argue that Epstein's private characterizations of Trump, including the knows how dirty Donald email, demonstrate that Epstein was a critic rather than a Confederate, and that the Republican counter-release documents this critical private posture. They would argue that the Republican counter releases 2,000 additional pages showing Epstein's private criticisms of Trump provide essential context that the Democratic selective release was designed to omit. They would argue that Lutnick's never met Epstein claim needs investigation rather than assumption of contradiction. That email coordination for a family trip by staff or assistants does not necessarily mean Lutnick personally met Epstein. And they would argue that the 1,000+ mentions finding is simply a reflection of the fact that Trump was a prominent public figure, and it's not surprising that he would come up frequently in the communications of someone like Epstein, who was also moving in elite circles. These are real arguments. The DOJ no evidence conclusion is authoritative. The Republican counter-release documents Epstein's private criticism. Email coordination can occur through intermediaries. Trump was a prominent public figure. These are all points that deserve acknowledgement and consideration. But here is what those arguments run into when you apply them to the documented record. The no evidence to charge DOJ conclusion is fully acknowledged and prominently presented throughout this script. It is the most authoritative official finding, and it is at the center of the accountability picture. But the no evidence to charge conclusion is specifically about chargeable criminal conduct. It does not address the documented gap between the distant acquaintance public characterization and the 1,000+ mentions more than twice as often as anyone else documented relationship extent. Those are two different things, and the DOJ conclusion doesn't resolve the second one. The Republican counter-release showing Epstein's private criticisms of Trump is fully documented in this script. Epstein making private positive and private negative characterizations of Trump simultaneously is a documented complexity that the complete file picture reveals rather than concealing. The fact that Epstein criticized Trump privately doesn't negate the fact that he also described extensive personal contact and puzzled over why Trump had escaped scrutiny. Both things can be true at the same time, and both are documented. The Lutnick emails versus never met contradiction is documented through two named Tier 1 sources, The Guardian for the emails and the New York Times for the public statement, making it more robustly documented than the Epstein unverified claims category. This isn't about interpretation. This is about documentary evidence contradicting a public statement that stands on its own regardless of what else is in the files. And the 1,000+ mentions finding requires a more substantive response than simply saying Trump was a prominent public figure. Being a prominent public figure doesn't explain why your name appears more than twice as often as anyone else in a convicted sex offender's private communications. There are other prominent public figures in these files. They don't appear anywhere near as frequently. The frequency suggests something more than just being famous. It suggests sustained engagement and sustained interest. So, here is the bottom line on all of this. PBS and CNN documented House Oversight Democrats releasing approximately 23,000 Epstein estate pages, including Epstein's 2011 Maxwell email describing Trump as having spent hours at his house and puzzling over why Trump has never once been mentioned, to which Maxwell replied, "I have been thinking about that." CNN documented Epstein separately writing that he knows how dirty Donald is and characterizing Trump as borderline insane. The BBC documented the DOJ's 3.5 million pages released under the disclosure law that Trump himself signed. NPR and the Miami Herald documented Trump's name appearing over 1,000 times, more than twice as often as any other individual. The Guardian documented DOJ's Todd Blanche, stating no communications show Epstein claiming Trump committed crimes against victims, and The Guardian independently confirmed the files do not implicate Trump in misconduct. The Guardian documented the Lutnick emails showing island trip coordination versus Lutnick's never met Epstein New York Times statement. And The Guardian documented extensive Bannon-Epstein correspondence, including PR rehabilitation discussions and exchanges joking about Trump. And NPR documented Republicans posting 2,000 additional pages showing Epstein's private criticisms and mental state concerns about Trump. The documented record shows a relationship more extensive and sustained than Trump has publicly acknowledged. The 1,000-plus mentions, the 2011 email, the Lutnick contradiction, the Bannon correspondence, but no evidence of criminal conduct by Trump. The truth is messier than simple partisan narratives, not proof of crimes, but not the distant relationship Trump's defenders claim either. And this is not the end. 3.5 million pages from the DOJ and 23,000 from the Oversight Committee are still being reviewed, with ongoing congressional oversight and investigative journalism still revealing more. That means there's more coming. There are still pages being reviewed, still connections being traced, still stories being pieced together. We are in the middle of this, not at the end, and every new release, every new document, every new investigation adds another layer to the picture. That's why we built Pump Politics. Real stories, real context, no corporate spin. We're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to give you the information you need to think for yourself. But hey, if you think the 3.5 million page DOJ release and the 23,000 page oversight release are the final chapters of the Epstein document accountability story, think again. The discharge petition we uncovered in the dedicated Epstein trip script, the ongoing congressional oversight, and whatever the next NPR documented missing pages investigation reveals are all still active. 3.5 million pages is a large document collection, and the investigative journalists who are reviewing it systematically are still publishing what they find. You are going to want to be here as those findings continue to emerge. Now let's talk about what this actually means for the broader political landscape. Because the Epstein documents aren't just about one person or one relationship. They're about a whole ecosystem of power, money, and influence that operated for decades with impunity. They're about how the wealthy and connected could operate above the law, how they could protect each other, how they could use their positions to escape accountability. And they're about how the systems that were supposed to hold people accountable, the legal system, the media, the political system, all failed to do their jobs. The fact that Trump's name appears more than 1,000 times in these files is not proof of criminal conduct, but it is proof of connection. It is proof that Trump was part of that world. It is proof that he moved in the same circles, that he was discussed extensively in Epstein's private communications, that people in Epstein's orbit were thinking about him and talking about him. And it is proof that the public characterization of the relationship as distant or inconsequential is not accurate. The Lutnick contradiction is even more directly troubling because it involves a sitting cabinet secretary making a public statement that appears to be contradicted by documentary evidence. This is not about interpretation or opinion. This is about what the documents show versus what a public official claimed. And when those two things don't match, it raises questions that demand answers. What else did Lutnick not disclose? What else are we not being told? These are legitimate questions that deserve investigation. The documents raise questions about Bannon's relationship with Epstein. What PR strategies were they discussing to rehabilitate Epstein's image? And was this happening with Trump's knowledge? The Republican counter-release showing Epstein's private criticisms of Trump adds complexity. Epstein was both positive and negative about Trump, making it not a simple story of loyalty, but a complex relationship that doesn't fully answer the questions. The bottom line, the documents show a more extensive and sustained relationship than Trump has acknowledged, with Trump a frequent subject in Epstein's private communications, and senior Trump figures like Bannon and Lutnick having documented connections to Epstein, though no evidence of criminal conduct by Trump has been found.